7 Things You Can't Say About China is by United States Senator Tom Cotton. It reached number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list, which was something of a surprise. It continues to sell and sell. If you have not yet purchased 7 Things You Can't Say About China, you ought to. Senator Cotton joins me now. Senator, are you surprised by the success of your book?
Well, Hugh, I was very sold so many copies, and I know it must have pained the editor at the New York Times to acknowledge it was the best-selling book in America the week it was announced. But I do think it reflects a deep appetite among the American people to learn more about the threat posed by communist China. As I say in the book, China is justly unpopular with the vast majority of Americans, and most of those Americans are very worried about China. But if anything, it's actually much worse. The threat is pervasive. It's present today. It's not remote in the future. And it is something that affects your everyday life in America, not just, something that might affect our strategic position in the world years from now.
When I talk to guests, I bring up the gray zone activities. China keeps flooding the waters around Taiwan with enormous ships, lots of overflights, lots of threatening gestures as a means of softening them up. Is that all it is, Senator, or do you think they might actually pull the go gun?
I don't think we can ever take that for granted, Hugh. I know that Taiwan, and for that matter, Japan, does not either. That's why the increasing number of recent years of naval and air patrols by Communist China in Taiwan's airspace and its waters, just like in Japan's Southwest Islands, are so deeply troubling. It gives the People's Liberation Army's Air Force and Navy more opportunities to train for the operation in which they might go for the jugular in Taiwan. It puts severe stress on Taiwan and Japan's military, both their equipment and their people. In times when you might be, say, doing operations or maintenance or training or just, giving your troops a break, they have to scramble to intercept those Chinese aircraft and ships. And I think it also can't help but to lead to a bit of a sense of complacency and dull the acuity of the antennae of everyone who's involved. If it's the 2000th time that China enters into Taiwan airspace and nothing happens, or on the 2001st time, maybe that's not a training exercise. Maybe that's actually the initial attack force. So I think that we have serious reason to be very concerned about all of these incursions.
Senator Rubio was my guest last week, now Secretary Rubio, and he said the story of the 21st century will be the story of the U.S.-China relationship. I'm sure you agree with that, but do you think the administration is prepared to roll out to increase our deterrence at max speed?
I do agree with what Marco Rubio said last week. It's really the first time, Hugh, that in the history of mankind that China and the United States have been strong together. China, for most of history, was the world's dominant superpower. We don't think about it in those terms because travel and communication was so limited. But until about 200 years ago, there's little question that China was the world's dominant power in terms of population and wealth and material power. That was overpassed eventually because of technological advances in Europe, and China entered what it still calls its century of humiliation about 200 years ago, which coincided with America's long rise to be the most dominant power in the history of mankind. And then China has returned in the last 30 or 40 years. So that, as I say, it's really the first time in human history that both China and the United States have been strong at the same time. And that's why the Trump administration, like I, are very, very focused on trying to rebuild deterrence as promptly as possible. Some of that is political, but some of it is material and military as well. I think a successful China policy 4 years from now would be Donald Trump handing the reins to the next guy without having had any conflict over Taiwan, with the peaceful status quo remaining in place, and with our military and Taiwan's military being much stronger and much more capable of deterring or, if necessary, winning that conflict in the future.
Yeah, we can only hope. Now, I had Major General Mel Spees on to open the program, retired United States Marine Corps. I asked him if we're producing strategists equipped to deal with China. And he was not dismissive of the idea, but downplayed that we are actually building strategists. Do you think we are?
To some extent, Hugh. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that appreciate the risk that China poses. It is, as I said, somewhat of a novel situation, and I don't think you can draw easy historic analogies. Sometimes people talk about Thucydides' trap with China and the United States. I think that is misplaced in some regard. Or they talk about Richard Nixon going to China and splitting it off from the Soviet Union. As you recall, Hugh, that split had already substantially occurred.
Yep.
I mean, there had been exchanges of fire across the Russian and Chinese border, and Mao once fled Beijing because he thought Russia might nuke him. So Nixon and Kissinger were recognizing the reality of what had already happened and trying to turn it to America's advantage. But there's no doubt there are many people that recognize China is the most serious threat we face, and they are taking steps to try to counteract that threat.
Does the budget and reconciliation package that you've seen, whether it's Lindsey Graham's or the one that came over from the House, does it take the kind of steps you want to see to keep the gap open between us and the People's Liberation Army and People's Liberation Army Navy?
Well, at this point, Hugh, it's still kind of broad brushes. The budget speaks in very broad categories. Only the legislation that implements that budget actually gets down to the fine details of, say, what kind of munitions we're going to buy or what kind of ships we're going to build. Right now, on that front, I prefer the Senate bill to the House bill. We allocated $150 billion to that kind of investment. The House did $100 billion. Of course, either one would be much, much better than Joe Biden's woeful budget. But we'll see where things shake out. I'm confident that whatever budget reconciliation bill we pass is going to take the steps necessary to help our military get ready to counteract the China threat.
Last question, Senator. For the first quarter, everyone told me that budget reconciliation package, one bill or two bill, you would have a plan and you would have an agreement by Easter. That does not seem to me realistic.
Well, Hugh, I want to say that I was not part of everybody. I suspected it might take longer than many people were predicting. I mean, that's one reason why the Senate wanted to pass a budget that focused on the border, on defense, and on energy production, because we know the tax code can be very hard. It's painstaking to reform. It implicates a lot of interest, and those are not always just partisan. Those can be regional as well. But whatever we end up passing, 1, 2, or 10 bills, I'm confident that it's going to do what's necessary to keep taxes low for working Americans, to get our economy growing, to keep prices stable, to produce more American energy, secure our border, and, as we've been discussing, to rebuild our military to confront the threat of communist China.
I hope you're right, Senator, but I sure wish you guys would move faster. Thank you for joining me. Follow him on X at @SendTomCotton. Go out and get this book, 7 Things You Can't Say About China. A very surprising bestseller, #1 on the New York Times list. I did not see that coming. 7 Things You Can't Say About China in bookstores now. Please also remember,